Good day. Events on the ground and announcements made over the last few hours suggest to me that we are perhaps now entering what could be the decisive period of the Ukraine war, and that war, the course of this war, will have been finally decided one way or the other by the end of August. Firstly, let's touch briefly on events on the ground, and the focus at the moment has to be Donbass, where we've just received information over the course of the last couple of hours that the Russians have made significant advances in the capture of Ukrainian fortified positions in northern Donetsk region. Now, I'm not going to go into the detail of this. One of the major targets seems to have been the Uglegorsk thermal power plant. If you want to understand why that is significant and important, there are other places which explain this all better than I can do, the Military Summary channel being one, and no doubt there are many others as well. But the key point is that it now does indeed look as if the main defense line, the main Ukrainian defense line, ahead of the Russian advance on the twin towns of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, the major operational center of Ukrainian forces in Donbass, that main defense line is now cracking, and that the fighting for Slavyansk and Kramatorsk will begin in earnest probably at the start of August. In that case, it's likely that the fighting in Donbass, in Donetsk region, will reach its culminating point over the course of August, and if previous patterns of the fighting which we've seen in Mariupol, in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk repeat themselves, which I have no reason to doubt that they will, then Slavyansk and Kramatorsk will fall to the Russians and their allied forces over the course of August, and the fighting in Donbass will effectively have ended. And that, I should say, will be the end, the successful end, from a Russian point of view, of phase 2 of their special military operation in Ukraine. Phase 1 was those first moves that we saw, the opening moves that we saw in the last days of February and throughout March, when the Russians captured southeastern Ukraine, essentially encircled Mariupol, but also pinned down large numbers of Ukrainian troops in places like Kiev, Chernigov, Sumy, and the rest. Phase 2, following the Russian withdrawal from the areas around Kiev, involved the Russians focusing on the battle in Donbass, and the Russian chief of operations of the Russian General Staff, General Rudskoy, said that phase 2 would be the battle for Donbass. And assuming that the Battle of Donbass ends in August, that will be the end of phase 2. Now, can I just say that this isn't just my words, just not based upon events on the ground. Various officials, including a senior official of the Donetsk People's Republic, has also said that he expects, and that the government of the Donetsk People's Republic now expects, that the Donetsk People's Republic, its territory, the Donetsk region, will have been fully cleared of Ukrainian forces by the end of August, with Lugansk region already under Russian and LPR, Lugansk People's Republic, control. That will mean that the entire Donbass, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic, the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, will be under Russian control also, ending phase 2. Now, at the same time as that is happening, we continue to see Ukraine trying to assemble forces to mount its counteroffensive in Kherson region. Now, in my previous video, I expressed skepticism about this whole idea. I said that it looked to me misconceived, and I now understand, though I stress I haven't yet seen it, that there's now doubts appearing in other places. Apparently, there is a report that a Ukrainian military person has said that in terms of artillery, Ukrainian forces in southwest Ukraine, in Kherson region, are heavily outgunned by the Russians, and that apparently he said that for every 8 shells the Ukrainians fire, the Russians are able to fire back 48. So that gives you some idea of the discrepancy of firepower in this area. And apparently there's a New York Times article, which, as I said, I haven't actually read, which goes on to say that Ukraine simply doesn't have enough men or machines or artillery to carry out this counteroffensive in Kherson region successfully. Now, if that is correct, if Donbass is cleared by the end of August, and if by the end of August the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kherson region has either failed to occur or has failed, then it seems to me that we are not just at the end of phase 2 of the special military operation, Russia's special military operation, but we will have reached that point of no return for Ukraine. At that point, with Ukraine unable to recapture its southern regions, with the Ukrainian army having suffered immense losses, and with Donbass under Russian control, it will be, I would have thought, all but impossible to persuade Western governments and Western publics that Ukraine can win the war, and it will be incredibly difficult and probably all but impossible for the Ukrainian government to persuade the Ukrainian people that Ukraine can win the war. Now, what the Ukrainian government will at that point do, I'm not going to try and guess, but let's assume that it decides nonetheless, despite all of these defeats, that it's going to continue fighting. I'm going to make a number of guesses as to what I think the next events would be. I think phase 3 would be a Russian advance from Donbass to the Dnieper River, to the area opposite the city of Dnipro, or Dnipropetrovsk, as the Russians still call it. And I suspect phase 3 will also involve the Russian investment and eventual capture of Kharkiv in the north of Ukraine and Zaporozhye in the south of Ukraine, both important industrial cities in east of the Dnieper River. And the military summary channel said in its latest briefing yesterday that the Russians are in the process of rebuilding or building up 16 further brigades made up of Eastern Ukrainians, presumably volunteers, the Odessa brigade that we've just been hearing about being the most important, 16 additional brigades which will then be committed to carrying out an advance in southern Ukraine towards the west, towards Odessa, but also probably taking in places like Nikopol and Kryvyi Rog, the important industrial city of Kryvyi Rog. That will be presumably phase 4. Now, the military summary channel said that these forces, these 16 brigades, will be ready by September, and that will be when that advance takes place, and that corresponds fairly well with the likely timing for the end of phase 2. I would add that if the Russians started to create these brigades in March, then that would mean that there would be a period of around 6 months to train and equip these brigades, which is probably consistent with the necessary training and equipment of brigades like this. Now, I want to stress this is the military summary channel that's saying this. I've seen no confirmation or corroboration of this from the official Russian government. So, this may be right or it may be wrong. The Odessa brigade certainly exists. Whether these other brigades exist also, I can't myself say. But one way or the other, I would have thought that once phase 3, that's to say the advance to the Dnieper in central Ukraine, and perhaps, almost certainly I would have thought, the occupation of Kharkiv and Zaporozhye has been completed, then if Ukraine still persists in continuing the war by that point, then I'm guessing that we would probably start to see phase 4, which would be the advance on Odessa, the Kryvyi Rog, Nikopol, and the rest. Now, of course, all of this depends on the successful completion of phase 2, the capture of Donbass by the end of August, and the failure of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kherson. Obviously, if the Ukrainians are able to hold on in Donbass, and if the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kherson region, contrary to my own expectations and those apparently of the New York Times, or these are someone writing for the New York Times, that if that Ukrainian counteroffensive is successful, then the picture changes completely, and then it will be clearly the Russians who will be on the back foot. But I have to say, that looks to me very unlikely, to the point of being almost fanciful. So the most plausible reconstruction of events, or so it seems to me, is a phase 2 ending by the end of August, Donbass being cleared, and of the Russians in a position to carry out phase 3 and or phase 4, perhaps simultaneously, perhaps in sequence, the advance to the Dnieper, the taking of Kharkiv and Zaporozhye, and perhaps also the advance towards Odessa and Kryvyi Rog and all of these places. Now, these are guesses, but they seem plausible guesses to me based on the flow of events. Of course, the other thing that might change the development of this picture is political decisions on the part of the West and of the authorities in Kiev to try to bring this war to an end. And the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, in a speech in Romania, has now called urgently for peace negotiations to begin. He says that Ukraine cannot win this war because of the asymmetric imbalance between itself and Russia. I think he's absolutely right. And Orban is essentially saying that the time window is closing, and that the longer this war is prolonged, the greater the debacle in Ukraine will be, which is what I have been saying, what we've been saying on the Duran, what so many other people have been saying, Brian Bertolich on the New Atlas, people like Daniel Davis, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, Lieutenant Colonel Scott Ritter, Lieutenant Colonel Douglas McGregor, all these military people. So many people have been saying, the Naked Capitalism website, all of these people have been saying, and of course what the Russians also have been saying, that if you're going to prevent a debacle from taking place, then the sooner you negotiate, the sooner you find a way to bring this war to an end, the better it will be. Will that happen? I don't know. I have to say at the moment there is little sign of this. But there is another aspect of this affair where the clock now is also ticking, because having apparently obtained the turbine from Canada that the Russians said they needed in order to restart Nord Stream 2, the Russians are now saying that there's another turbine, Nord Stream 1. The Russians are now saying that there's another turbine that needs repair. And the result is that Nord Stream 1, even with the return of the turbine from Canada, that Nord Stream 1 cannot work at more than 20% capacity. And this has caused gas prices across Europe to spike. I just before making this video saw a report that they now stand at $2,000 per million cubic meters, unprecedentedly high at this time of the year. We're still in July, and much of Europe is still experiencing a heat wave. But there we go. So it does look increasingly as if the energy crisis, the gas crisis in Europe is deepening. And it isn't just gas prices. Oil prices are also rising again. Brent crude, as of the time of making this video, is trading at $106 to the barrel. Now, that is really surprising, because all the indicators, both in Europe and in the United States, and indeed in many other places, are now flashing recession signals. The Federal Reserve Board is widely expected to raise interest rates tomorrow. The European Central Bank has already raised interest rates. There's large expectations that recession is going to come. There's some indications that in the United States, the country is already in recession. And of course, in Germany, business confidence has collapsed. And there's strong reasons to think that Germany is also probably already in recession or will be very soon. Now, usually when a recession like this happens, that leads to a fall in demand for oil products, and that in turn also leads to a fall in the price of oil. Now, that's not really happening this time, at least not for the moment. And I can't help but think that what is keeping the price of oil elevated is supply issues caused by the economic war. Now, some of these supply issues may be more in the imagination than in fact. There's no indication that there's less oil being traded globally. But if you understand that there are now structural problems impeding the flow of oil to where it's needed, then that explains the supply, supply problems and the escalating cost. By this I mean that Russian oil production, as we now know, is now actually higher than it was this time last year, and has been higher throughout the first 6 months of this year. It's been higher than it was in 2021. But this oil is being exported, but it is being exported to specific markets. It's being exported to India and China, and it's being exported to these markets at a discount. Now, that means that this oil cannot flow to where demand is highest and where price is highest, which is Europe. And it's this restriction on the price of oil, it's this interference with oil flows, which I suspect is now creating these market distortions, which are leading to the higher oil prices. And of course, on top of all of that, we have the added uncertainty created by Janet Yellen's oil price cap scheme, The Russians have said, Vladimir Putin has said, that if this scheme is ever implemented, then Russia will simply withhold oil from the market. And a Russian energy official has said that if this oil price scheme were implemented on the terms that Yellen has suggested, then it would not be economic for Russia to sell its oil because the oil would be trading at below its production cost. Well, I suspect that these Russian warnings are weighing on the market as well. And they're one of the factors which are supporting the oil price, despite the fact that we're now looking at clear recession signals in the West, with all the expectation that that would lead to a fall in demand. What we are seeing, in other words, is the way in which Western policies, Western sanctions policies, are creating market distortions which are elevating the price of oil. And that, of course, is what often happens. In fact, economists of the Austrian school would say it is what always happens when governments try to interfere and control and redirect and constrain a market in a particular way. It creates problems, it creates distortions in the market, it affects the market's smooth operation, and these inefficiencies in the market are reflected in higher prices. And I think, generally speaking, that is probably true. Of course, there's still some people who expect that a recession will eventually bring the oil price down. And that may be correct, but I think one has to ask a number of questions about this. Firstly, how deep will that recession need to be in order for these structural problems and distortions which have been created in the oil market to be so discounted as to cause the oil price to fall? It may be that you need a very deep recession indeed. But perhaps worse and conceivably more plausible is that even if you get a recession, and even if the oil price falls, these distortions and structural imbalances in the market will mean that the oil price remains higher than it would otherwise have been. So you might see a fall in the oil price, but not a fall as great as it would be if the market were functioning normally. Now that would benefit some producers. It would benefit the Saudis, who must be making a killing out of this whole situation. And it might even benefit to some extent the Russians. I can't see how that would help consumers and businesses in the West. And if that is true, if that is correct, then one can see how it would prolong the recession, because it would mean that in a situation where energy prices are higher than they would properly be, taking the recession into account, then a recovery in the Western economies would face the problem that it would be running against the pressure of higher oil prices, higher energy prices, and that might create difficulties in coming out of the recession. And of course it would be also, and this I've discussed many times in many programs, be locking the Western economies into structural uncompetitiveness against, in particular, their Asian competitors, which would weaken the underlying position of Western economies and might prolong the recession even more. So we are looking at a very grim picture. And bear in mind that all of this threatens to hit home at almost exactly the same time when, if my guesstimations of the military picture are also right, they will all hit home at precisely the moment when it would become impossible for Western governments and Western media to deny any further that Ukraine was losing the war and that the West was facing a debacle in Ukraine. So we would have, by the end of August, the beginning of September, perhaps over the course of September, a major military crisis in Ukraine, and we would at the same time have a gathering economic crisis in Europe at precisely that point. I cannot imagine, I can't see how that benefits Western governments and Western political leaders. Now, I think some of the more far-sighted of them are starting to see this. Now, Viktor Orban, and we have to qualify any reference to him as a Western leader, because the leaders of the West probably would deny that he is, and anyway, he is, in a sense, very semi-detached and has been openly sceptical about this whole affair all along. Anyway, Orban has already straightforwardly said this whole thing has been misconceived. It's failing at every level. The sanctions have been a failure. The war is a failure. We've got to sit down. We've got to negotiate and talk as soon as possible. And he's urging that these negotiations should take place not between Russia and Ukraine. Orban accepts that Ukraine is incapable of conducting negotiations. They need to happen between the United States and Russia. So Orban understands this. But perhaps a more interesting person who clearly also understands this is Mario Draghi in Italy. Now, I've been reading a huge amount about the so-called fall of Mario Draghi, about how his political position has collapsed, how apparently the Italian parties, the Five Star Movement, all of them were apparently antagonized by his arrogance, his stubbornness, his unwillingness to compromise, his disdain for the Italian parliament, his disdain for the Italian political system, all of which no doubt is true. But it is not the reason why Mario Draghi will soon no longer be Prime Minister of Italy. I think this has been very widely misunderstood, and I want to clarify the point all over again. What has caused the government crisis in Italy is not that Draghi was overthrown. It is that Draghi has deserted his post. He has run away. What he did was that he took a parliamentary defeat in the Italian parliament over a waste incinerator in Rome, a vote which the Five Star Movement had made it very clear they couldn't support him, but which he nonetheless won. He's taken that, it wasn't a defeat because he actually won the vote. He took the fact that the Five Star Movement wasn't willing to support him on this issue of the waste incinerator as a reason to resign. Now, that was completely unexpected across the entire Italian political system. Apparently, he made threats to resign, but nobody took them seriously. And people were right not to take him seriously, because it is a ludicrous issue to resign over. Now, this is in no way to deny, the fact that this waste incinerator issue in Rome is probably a very big topic and a controversial issue in Rome itself. Rome let's be straightforward about this, has never perhaps been the cleanest of places, and it's having a lot of problems with waste, and this is a controversial issue, and there were arguments about it, and the Five-Star Movement, for its part, was only prepared to support this waste incinerator idea if it got all kinds of economic concessions that would support living standards, which it wanted because it felt that its support in Italy is falling, and it wanted to show to its electoral base that it is capable of achieving something. Now, in coalition politics, especially in Italian coalition politics, this sort of thing is not uncommon. Draghi, after all, won the vote. Five-Star Movement made its point. So there was no real reason why Draghi could not have just carried on. But instead of doing that, he announced his intention to resign. And this caused utter shock and dismay across the political system. The president of Italy, President Mattarella, asked him to stay on, and he agreed to stay on until a vote of confidence. And of course, that vote of confidence duly took place, and Draghi won. Now, again, it's true that the major parties who have been supporting his coalition, the Northern League and the Five-Star Movement, both abstained. And realistically, by this point, it's very difficult to see how Draghi could have survived as Prime Minister for much longer, despite winning this no confidence vote. But the fact is that this is a crisis that Draghi created himself. There's no popular movement in Italy at the moment to have Draghi removed from office. He has his critics in Italy. The Brothers Party has never liked him and have always opposed him, and have, as a result, seen their support rise. But the entire political class, the established political class in Italy, wanted Draghi to stay on. And not just the political class. There's now been a whole cascade of demands from professional organizations, from lawyers, from unions, from business federations, all of these calling on Draghi to remain Prime Minister of Italy. And yet, he's going. So why, despite this very strong depth of support for him, despite the fact that actually he's won the votes in the Italian Parliament, despite the fact that this vote on the waste incinerator issue was not an issue over which Draghi really needed to resign, why is he going? The reason is he wants to. He wants to because he's perhaps a more far-sighted man. He's certainly, in my opinion, a cleverer man than some of the other European leaders. He was, after all, the head of the European Central Bank. He's been around in politics and finance for a long time. He can read the writing on the wall. He knows that the war in Ukraine is going badly wrong, and he knows that the sanctions policy that he supported has backfired disastrously. He knows that the European Central Bank is now raising interest rates. Even at the time when he announced he was going to resign over the waste incinerator episode, he would have known that the European Central Bank sooner or later was bound to raise interest rates. He knows that the European Central Bank is having difficulty finding some mechanism to go on buying Italian government debt, which has increased during the period that Draghi has been Prime Minister. And he knows that Italy is not in good shape to navigate a recession. And lastly, he knows that as a result of the energy sanctions that he imposed on Russia, or the sanctions that he supported against Russia, that the result is that Italy is now paying, I believe, the highest electricity prices in the whole of the EU, which is really remarkable. And so he knows that sometime around the autumn, Italy will be in deep crisis, and his peerless reputation as this economic genius, this wizard, would unravel. And as a proud man, one could come up with a rather more critical adjective, but as a proud man, he doesn't want to be around when it happens. He doesn't want to see his reputation collapse. He doesn't want to see his government collapse. He doesn't want the fingers pointing at him. He wants to be out of the picture before that takes place, so that he can leave his post, much regretted, as the great reformist prime minister who was navigating Italy successfully until all these bad people in the Five Star Movement and the League and all the others engineered his removal. Now, I can see how that works for Mario Draghi, but I have to say this, and I come back to what I said. To me, it looks like a desertion. It's an abdication of responsibility. What Draghi should do, or should have done in this kind of situation, was not run away, which is essentially what he is doing. He should have stood and argued with people like Habeck in Germany and Ursula von der Leyen in the Commission, and Macron, who's sounding increasingly deranged, even as one senses even he realises that the writing is on the wall. Draghi should have argued with all of these people that this has gone as far as it can possibly go, that the sanctions war has failed, exactly as Orban says, and that the war in Ukraine is being lost, exactly as Orban says, and Draghi should have teamed up with Orban and worked to reverse the policies which have led Italy and Europe, and of course Ukraine, into this disaster. Well, he didn't, because of course he doesn't want to break with the establishment, which after all he also believes in its ideas. So he didn't want to do that, and he chose to run away instead. You could perhaps start thinking a little bit of metaphors like rats jumping off sinking ships. I'm not going to say more. But anyway, that's what happened. That's what's happened in Italy. And it is a telling sign of what will come. Now, there's still a short time window of a few weeks left before we get to that point. But that time window needs to be used purposefully and effectively. Schemes like trying to ration the use of gas through what is left of the summer are not going to solve the problems that the EU is now facing. If the Russians see that, assuming that the Russians really are dialing down, the gas supply, assuming that they do that, the more that the EU rations, the more the Russians presumably will just go on turning the dial. You can't, it seems to me, in the end, win against this kind of game when it's the Russians ultimately who control the supply. So rationing isn't going to work. All it's doing is creating arguments and quarrels amongst EU states at a time when the instinct of EU governments will be to hoard energy rather than to share it. So that's not, it seems to me, an effective plan. An effective plan is to telephone Vladimir Putin, say to him, we understand the situation. Let's have a meeting, and it really does need a meeting, and let's try and thrash something out. Now, the reality is, as I've said many times, that the energy partnership between Russia and Europe is done. It's finished. It won't be rebuilt to what it was before February 2022. But you could negotiate a transition period to smooth the damage. And you might also be able to negotiate something which would allow some kind of Ukraine to survive. And that, obviously, it would expose you to huge criticisms. You'd have all the usual suspects coming out and talking about the betrayal of Ukraine and all that. But it would at least let you come away with something. The alternative is that come the autumn, come the winter, you will be in deep crisis. And where the war in Ukraine is concerned, you'll be left with nothing at all. Now, to me, it's a no-brainer. To Western politicians, well, maybe they don't want to see it that way. I hope that they do. I would say that the option that Draghi has exercised of running away was one which I suspect is unique to him. I don't see how people like Scholz and Macron, let alone Habeck and Ursula, can do the same. But there we go. I'm going to say it straightforwardly. I think Draghi took the dishonourable course. The honourable course is to do that which must be done in the interests of Europe and peace, even if it is embarrassing and humiliating, and even if it means the end of one's career. Well, our Ursula, Robert Habeck, Olaf Scholz, Emmanuel Macron, are all of these, Josep Borrell, are all of them capable of that? I hardly think so. But I think it needs to be said. Let's see what happens. Thank you for joining me again today. Remember, you can find us on other platforms, above all locals, but also Telegram and Rumble. You find links under this video. Remember also that you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. Please also remember that you can come to our shop, buy the amazing things that you will find there, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And also, last but not least, please remember to press the like button if you've liked this video and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day until then.